The government have presented this bill as making the UK the safest place in the world. And I think it's an indication of the fact that safety is going to continue to trump liberty in every single instance. And I wrote a book on that a few years ago on this, the issue of safetyism threatening free speech, one of the reasons I'm here. But the other reason is, as Jan has explained, I'm a legislator, and I wanted to just run through some details on this bill, because I can tell you in the House of Lords, this bill has been discussed more than almost anything else, even though it's not formally arrived yet. It's constantly referred to by government ministers and by members of the House of Lords as the thing they're most looking forward to, which would indicate that I'm going to be rather isolated. And therefore, I'm going to play this like this because it's true. I need to understand the detail of this bill, what it really means, because at the moment, I'm just a free speecher who suspects this bill is dangerous, and I've read the briefings, but I'm going to therefore ask questions that help us get beneath it. So I wanted to start by explaining that if in that debate in the House of Lords, whenever it comes up, both Rado and Matthew, the main things that are discussed are the idea that this is a bill that will stop harassment online. It's usually harassment of women. There's lots of talks of Twitter pylons. There was a question today that 5 years after Joe Cox's murder, that's why we need the online safety bill. That's the kind of way it's allied together. And the other issues are that this will protect children from the exploitation of pornography, and we will be able to eradicate child porn and terrorist content. So I wanted to just get that out of the way, because that's what people think this bill is about. And in a way, it is trying to tackle difficult issues like that. So Rado, maybe just kind of your thoughts on how you deal with those kind of questions.
Thanks a lot, Claire. I should say that, look, it's tremendous to be doing this with a co-author, but at the FSU, we believe in debate, and Matthew and I are going to try very hard to find some areas of disagreement about this bill, because in general, we are both very concerned, and I think we've found similar sort of areas that are bothering us, but we'll break that down. What's this about? So people say that, so you're hearing in the Lords that this is about tackling these harms that you've described. And in a sense, that's fair enough, because there is such a thing as online harms. There are such things as genuine harms online, and more exactly, harms that are broadcast online that happen offline. And some of the original intentions of this bill were, arguably the very first intentions for this bill were to tackle those. The problem is that this bill, I mean, I have it here, and it is an absolute brick of a document. It is enormous. And since it began, which was some years ago now under Theresa May's government, under Home Secretary Sajid Javid, it has become this receptacle for all sorts of definitions of harm. And the concept of harm was not defined for a long time, but it now is. And so while we have on one hand, genuine harms that it attempts to deal with to children, terrorism and issues like this, partly through re-legislating, but we can get on with that. But we think these are perfectly valid areas for government. It also has at its core the belief that it is the responsibility of government, imposed through internet companies, in particular search engines and user-to-user, so social networks, the responsibility to protect adults from harm, in particular, harm that is legal offline. So what's happened? I mean, if we just look at our concerns for free speech, it seems increasingly like this has become, as I say, this receptacle for parts of the bureaucracy, for institutions that monitor and increasingly seek to control areas of speech that some of them they regard as hateful, where they are imposing these different definitions of harm that are to do with speech in a way that feels, I'll speak for myself, feels to me slightly like a counter-reformation against the internet, that the internet has been in so many ways this wonderful almost new version of the printing press where all sorts of opinions get aired. Some of them are manifestly unpleasant. But whereas that establishment, back in the 90s had 4 broadsheets that defined respectable opinion, now respectable opinion is perhaps out of control, out of their control, and a new set of rules to control and guide opinion seems to be being created. And that, I think, for me, is what is the kind of core concern in this bill. So I'm sure this evening, be able to break that down, which sections are really, really troubling us. But Matt will have his own views.
Matt, as well, if you can start to lead us into discussing the concept of duty of care as well, which is the way that this is being dealt with, a completely new way of considering this, is that internet companies are being told that they have a duty of care to take responsibility for the safety of users in order to protect them from some of these both harms that we know are harms, and then this broader definition of harms.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you to the FSU for inviting me to speak and putting on this event, and willingness to tackle what is quite a thorny and difficult issue, one in which not all traditional supporters of free speech are necessarily willing to do it. I think your first question, just to go into that very quickly and then come back to the duty of care point, which is there are genuine issues going online. There is unlawful behavior at an extraordinary rate. And there is, I think, a decent argument to say that the online space is one in which there is a lot of good happening in the world. At the same time, there is people who choose to exploit it. Just to be absolutely clear here, this bill will do practically nothing to stop genuine online unlawful behavior that is normally talked about, like child exploitation or terrorist content. Most of that does not happen in sites that are in scope of this bill. This bill will only deal with search engines and social media sites. We'll not deal with the dark web where the worst of things are going on. It can't really do much unless it does successfully undermine encryption on private signal chats. So the first point I think to make is that despite the way this is being framed, practically speaking, it is going to do very little to tackle those issues. What it does do is actually far broader and far more ambitious than what the government usually tries to sell this as. As you've said, it creates this so-called duty of care. Now, it's quite a weird concept of duty of care in this context, because traditionally duty of care might be, well, you sell me a chair, the chair falls apart, I hurt myself, you have a duty to me because of the fact that I've hurt myself from your product. What it's actually doing here is you're putting a duty on Facebook to prevent one user from harming another user. So in the first instance, this is not a law about the social media companies. It's a law about you and I. It's a law about you and I because it's about the speech that we are allowed to say on these platforms and completely changing the government's relationship with these private companies. Now, I know there's a lot of complaints, rightfully so, about online censorship, but this would effectively mandate that the Stepford sisters on campus, on steroids, on social media. It is the snowflake charter to the extremity. So there's it's kind of hard to know where to start here just because it's such a long bill and there's so many different things going on, so many things the government's trying to do. But we got this question in just a second ago asking about, can you give us examples of this speech that would be legal offline that is now illegal online? The important thing to note about this is that within the duties of care the government's creating, there's a few different more specific categories of expectations. One is to do with child protection, which we can come back to, and I think there's some interesting discussion there. But secondly, that it's to remove illegal content. Now, that's probably the least controversial part of the bill. A few people, in fact, they basically already have to remove that content anyway. It's actually, in some ways, unnecessary. What it does do, though, in addition to that, is it puts this duty of care on the largest companies, particularly I'm talking Google, Facebook, Twitter, maybe some large gaming sites, whatever else it may be. And what it says to them is that they will have a duty to prevent any adverse physical or psychological impact on their users. So as you can see, that's an extremely broad category. That is quite an extraordinary language. And they have to do it basically based upon the average person's common sensibilities. Now, my common sensibilities are probably very different to yours. And the common sensibilities of a 23-year-old activist, social justice warrior, as opposed to a 50-year-old Pakistani man who might think anything that speaks ill of Islam is problematic, whatever else it may be. Everyone's common sensibility is very different. So somehow OFCOM, which we'll come back to later, somehow the social media companies are going to have to basically speak to everyone's sensibilities and prevent them from any harm to themselves by seeing content with which they could be theoretically psychologically harmed by. It's an extremely broad category. Practically speaking, they're going to be making codes of conduct, and that's codes of conduct about things like hate speech. So things like disinformation, all these kind of topics that are very thorny when it comes to free speech. And are going to give extraordinary powers to the government to basically decide, both the government today, and we'll come back to this as well, future governments as well will be able to effectively direct Ofcom about what kind of content will and won't be allowed on these platforms. So in a very broad summary, it is something when it comes to duty of care that is effectively requiring the companies to remove quite substantial amounts of content.
So Rado, just to push this a bit more, one of the reasons why it's nerve-wracking for people to get involved in this discussion, I think, I'm a prime example of somebody who made a complete hash of it in the past, is that because you sort of try and say, look, don't use the issue of, child porn or whatever to ban things on to generally police the internet. If anyone has seen me on Twitter, people now think that I'm pro child porn, and I made a hash of trying to get into that discussion. And the reason I'm saying that is because there's quite a sort of chilling effect already for people not wanting to be seen as being glib about, women being harassed by trolls, the whole children question. So just in terms of this harmful content, then we know that some of these things are real nasties, right? But your concern in terms of this this duty of care to look at harmful content in terms of psychological, it seems to me that these companies have been given an enormous amount of power now by the government. It's not even the government, the companies, to decide what's harmful. And if you object, they kind of going to accuse you of not caring about children, or being even worse than that, kind of somehow an apologist for some of these awful things that you can find online. Do you just want to kind of dig into that a bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are not being glib about the genuine harms that happen online. Government should legislate and legislate to punish harshly crimes that are disseminated and broadcast online. Now, it already does that. Our focus is not on the legislation on those issues in the bill. We've mentioned child abuse and terrorism as justifiable areas. That said, I do want to agree with Matt that this bill does not mainly tackle that, and will not, in my view as well, tackle that effectively. We've said in our previous paper on this, You're on Mute, and most of our publications on this, that there are very good things that the government can do in that area, and they include better resourcing organisations like the National Crime Agency, whose job it is to deal with this quite rightly. But as Matt said, this bill won't really do much of that, and it mainly is about dealing with speech on search engines and social networks, which is not the main question. What it does, as he said, is impose this concept of the duty of care, whereby, and the crux of this is government intervention towards speech online that is legal offline in the name of defending adults from harms by speech, not video or photos or whatnot, by speech that's legal offline. So the concept of the duty of care is probably an infringement of personal responsibility, because it makes these companies responsible for adults' well-being, and it's implemented in this concept of the code of practice, which Ofcom will have a duty to essentially police, and failures to adhere to the duties. We should really talk about duties of care, because there are various different duties under this overall duty. Failure to adhere to this will be met by punishment, and at times very punitive fines. So the duties now include some duty to protect freedom of association. We'll come on to these carve-outs that have happened. Some duty to protect so-called debate of democratic importance, which is now going to be decided in legislative wording by the state. The state will now get into the business of deciding which of our debates are democratically important and which are sort of too wishy-washy to merit special legal protection. And again, as Matt said, at the center of this adult harm concept is a defense against offense to people of normal sensibilities. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go into the adult harms definition in some detail. I think we need to do that because, because I think we're all interested, but this is the kind of central risk in this bill for me, that the companies will now need to assess risk. So there's some vagary there of content and design, so of their websites, posing risks to adults via adult harm defined as material risk of the content having or indirectly having a significant adverse physical or psychological impact on an adult of ordinary sensibilities. This is the definition of harm that after 2 years the government has come up with. Now, some people say, well, actually, we should be quite reassured by that, because that makes the bar so high that how could you really demonstrate adverse psychological impact, not annoyance or offense, but impact on an adult of ordinary sensibilities? The problem is, these are going to be put into codes of practice in partnership with social media companies who are frankly often completely woke. And it's going to be enforced by OFCOM, whose attitude to free speech we go into in our briefing. But I'm afraid the definition becomes more troubling because it says, the next point is, this should be assumed to affect people with a certain characteristic or combination of characteristics, or to particularly affect a certain group of people. Now, you can imagine how all sorts of religious groups could seize on that and say, well, I am particularly affected by and adversely psychologically impacted in the long run by these cartoons, potentially, or by these comments. And the next is the dissemination of this content. So material risk of the fact of the content's dissemination. The optimistic take on that is that's designed to stop mobbing. The pessimistic take is, could a politician say, well, look, this, I'm being mobbed here. This is unfair comment about me. This has to go. So another danger there. Finally, and this for me is the most concerning part of this definition, is there's a reference to indirect harms. So that content could cause an individual to do or say certain things. So companies are now being made responsible for what individuals could be caused to do by reading something online. So we have this huge, we're not kidding when we say this is a dog's dinner of a bill, I'm afraid. And we have this swathe now of these potentially very serious controls on freedom of speech that are going to be in the hands of OFCOM.
I just want to add one more point there in terms of one other duty that we haven't really discussed yet, which I kind of flagged, I said we'll come back to, which is there's particular requirements when it comes to children. So there's specific duties on the companies, and this is something that sounds in itself like a good idea, that the companies would have some kind of duty to protect children. There's a few problems with this. The first problem is, how do you know who a child is? So there's going to effectively be a mandate on these companies to do what is basically known as age verification. So every time you sign up to a major website, let's say Facebook or Twitter or Google, you will be expected, I believe in future under this law, to put forward your driver's license, passport, or credit card to prove that you're an adult. And if you don't put that forward, if you don't identify yourself, which obviously raises serious privacy questions, you could only be able to see content that is acceptable to the sensibilities of a child by default. The default situation for all users will be to actually treat them like children, which is even more extreme. Then you've also got to ask a question. You talk a lot about the right of children not to see certain content, but also in reverse, what might be appropriate for a 16-year-old child might not be appropriate for an 8-year-old child, for example, or 17 or 14. It's not clear at all the extent to which we should be limiting children's freedom as well in such an extreme sense. And that's not a particularly popular point to make, but there's certain categories of content that you don't obviously want them accessing unlawful content or, in that respect, but there are a lot of other potentially harmful to content to some children that might not necessarily be harmful to other children, especially if you're a 17-year-old, that kind of limits on their freedom is something to think about as well. But in any case, it basically requires everyone be treated as if they are a child by default, which I think is quite a bizarre premise of a law. and create some quite extraordinary regulatory issues. Because if you're worried about online monopolies, this is the best way to create an online monopoly, which is create this extraordinary regulatory framework that is extremely expensive, it costs billions of dollars in order to comply with, and put this on all the companies, because the likes of Facebook and Twitter can probably comply, but no one will ever be able to compete with them at scale if you have all these kind of requirements when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to speech.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more directly obvious political issues is the amount of focus on disinformation and misinformation. And I wouldn't mind you explaining the difference between those two things, because they're not the same, even as they're discussed. But again, this is one of those popular ideas. So the way it's been discussed in the Lords, to me, and when it's come up, is to say this bill will be brilliant because, you know, the country is being wrecked by anti-vaxxers and their misinformation or their disinformation. And it's a much more explicit political thing. We've got to stop the public hearing these political ideas because they're lies, right? And they're just wrong, and so on and so forth. And we've already seen a bit of that. A bit. During the pandemic, we've seen a huge amount of companies themselves making those decisions. But can you explain how the bill forces them now to make decisions, and a couple of kind of side issues, if you could kind of either of you address, which is they're sort of saying, well, it's not censorship, Claire, it's warnings, or it's a use of algorithms in a particular way so that the wrong people don't get access to it, you know, deboosting and all of these kind of shadow ban and all that. Anyway, could you just kind of explain why this bill is different to what's already happening, where we know that, for example, Facebook have taken down videos that they think go against public health recommendations or WHO or whatever, the World Health Organization. But anyway, I'll come to you, Rado, first. Just any thoughts on that, and then just both deal with that.
Right. So thanks for the question. It's very interesting. It's important to give credit to the government for some improvements to this bill. So what's happened basically in this bill is that the question of disinformation and misinformation seems to have been kicked to an extent into the long grass. So OFCOM will be asked to set up a committee, largely appointed by OFCOM, of experts who, you know, could come from any persuasion in theory, to look at the question of disinformation and misinformation. So there isn't yet the direct imposition of a definition of what this is, or rather a direct imposition of what will have to be removed by companies yet. But it still gives a green light to a regulator with a history of censoriousness to act against this area in the way it sees fit. Now, in the last consultation document, the government defined disinformation and misinformation quite clearly in ways that trouble us. So it said misinformation is inadvertently spreading false information, which could just mean accidentally saying something that's not correct. And so what we said, you know, whatever happened to just getting things wrong in a debate? And actually, the government has already got into trouble in this area, because in its previous consultation, it approvingly linked to, implying it was best practice, the YouTube page that explains why they feel free to remove health content that contradicts advice given by the World Health Organization as an anti-disinformation and misinformation policy. So that's no, they don't call for that here, and the government condemned that. But the question is, what will be in codes of practice after Ofcom have looked at this? You mentioned algorithms, and actually the government have said that they want more transparency on how search engines will, or rather they want to impose new rules on how search engines will use algorithms that protect users from harm, such as with the indexing and presentation of results, which could be a general license to woke search results, or it could be a license to address the so-called disinformation. And we've said that the best way to address the disinformation and misinformation issue is for more debate, not less. And what's happened over the last year, for example, with the Wuhan lab leak theory, gradually seeping out, having been described as a conspiracy theory that was often suppressed to some extent by parts of the media, and gradually leaking out as an entirely plausible scientific theory, on which I take no view, by the way. I don't know either way, I don't claim to, but clearly that needs, for public safety and for the good of public health, clearly needs to be debated as much as possible. That is how you ascertain what disinformation and misinformation is, by exposing it to the fullness of debate.
Okay, thanks. Matthew, quickly on this, because we've got so much to get through, but anything to add on this one?
Well, I'll just quickly say that the whole point of debate is you don't know in advance what truth and truth isn't, and what effectively the disinformation framework kind of makes a company do, and they're being pressured into doing, which is choose supposedly authoritative sources of information that end up having their own biases, because every source of information does. And we've seen this time and time again throughout the pandemic, how supposedly authoritative organizations just get things wrong. You just don't know things in advance necessarily. And it's actually important to have these debates. And therefore, this is actually quite it's effectively an effort to take certain issues out of public debate and just allowing elites to decide what can and cannot be expressed in a very blatant way, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks. Now, we've been kind of hinting that, you both mentioned lots of times, which is OFCOM. Now, because OFCOM already exists, and, in a way, it's a respectable regulator. I mean, I say that in inverted commas, but it's a respectable regulator. What is shocking when I've kind of read up on this is how much more, when I say it's a respectable regulator, a contentious respectable regulator, but nonetheless it exists. What is most extraordinary is the enormous amount of power that Ofcom is going to be given by this piece of legislation. Unparalleled. I think you quote somebody saying a de facto parallel legal system, a judge, jury, and executioner. But can you just explain what your concerns are? Because all of this is how it's going to happen. And how it's going to happen is that Ofcom have got this enormous power. Is that right? I mean, and yeah, am I over demonizing Ofcom? What am I to be worried about?
Why don't I just quickly go into the structure of how the law will work in practice, and maybe Rado, you can speak a bit more to the Ofcom itself. Basically, the law in practice, so it creates this duty of care, and then it says Ofcom will design codes of conduct. And in order to fulfill the duty of care, effectively the easiest way is just to say you're following whatever Ofcom tells you to do. So Ofcom will have the power through these duty of care, through these codes of conduct that they design, to decide what the way that effectively these private companies structure their terms and conditions, and then how they moderate content. And Ofcom can basically decide at any time, more or less, that we're concerned about issue racism, and therefore we're going to change around the definition, or we're interested in disinformation, therefore you're going to have to deprioritize, you're going to have to shadow ban certain content that might not be factful. So it gives all this power to Ofcom, effectively outsourcing what should be legislative decision, which is to decide what speech isn't allowed. And that should be your job, Claire, as a politician, as someone who's elected by the people. And it just gives a very broad license to Ofcom to define what it means to anything that is psychologically or physically harmful to someone. Now, there is a bit of ministerial oversight, and something the government's actually kind of proud of, is the sense that the Secretary of State will have the power to set Ofcom's priorities. They'll also have the power to look at these codes of conduct, reject or accept them. And then they'll kind of go before Parliament for 20 days. And if you don't look at them, which most parliamentarians won't, it'll just automatically become the rules. Now, that might be okay under Oliver Dowden, who might have an appreciation for freedom of expression. I'm not certain about that, but he might be a relatively good person who has no bad intentions whatsoever. But the problem is, once you create a framework like this and you give such extraordinary power through politicians, through this regulator, you're basically asking for a disastrous future which anyone could step in. If this legislation was passed before the 2019 election, Jeremy Corbyn won, his crony was in DCMS, the Secretary of State there, they could effectively direct Ofcom as to what content is no longer allowed at all online. So let's say, we actually think anyone who supports capitalism is, going against the socialist Marxist mission of this Labour government, and therefore the Ofcom must take a very close look at the psychological harm that is causing to people. But you can very quickly see how if once you had this kind of framework in place, there's almost limitless powers provided to Ofcom and to the Secretary of State and to a future government. I think Tories should be very careful about putting in place powers that they would not want their opponents to have. I think that's a mistake governments make all the time.
Just a couple of misinformation bits, i.e. inadvertently. I've never been elected, so that's a real problem.
Sorry.
We should abolish the House of Lords. It's an absolute affront on democracy, but that's neither here nor there. Now that I'm there, I'm trying to do some good with it. But the second bit of misinformation is, the idea that Oliver Dowden is to be trusted with our freedoms. I mean, do me a favour. I mean, one of the things that's shocking is that you don't need to have a scare tactic about what if it was a Corbynista as a Secretary of State, because the present government are bringing in this bill enthusiastically, and they are not indicating the smidgen of regard for freedom. So anyway, over to Rado.
I think the point is simply that it could get much worse, or even worse, if there's a government of more centralised.
No, but I meant on the whole Ofcom stuff.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, I'm just putting that in there. Yeah, I mean, what's going to happen here? Ofcom the government has said it will have a role in assessing, and may have the one role in assessing complaints by internet companies. And it said in a note that it will also have a role in assessing complaints by individuals. Now, what that seems to mean, this is a point that I think the BBC's tech correspondent has made, is Ofcom going to become a kind of national oversight board for all tech corporates and everybody who potentially has a complaint? Now, good luck. And that will make the already hefty price tag that already runs into the billions look small, because it will cost a huge amount. That said, one of the problems with this bill is that we've seen this pile on from different interest groups. So we've seen carve-outs that we'll get onto for journalism, carve-outs for regulated news services, carve-outs for so-called democratically important content. Because newspaper editors have lobbying capacities, they have a trade association, and various companies have trade associations, and interests have been heard. This is what happens with government. Lobbying interests have been heard. Freely associating individuals don't have lobbyists. And so how will they in reality be able, that's partly why this bill is such a problem, and why we're moving out towards this kind of licensed journalism situation, where there are journalists who have protections, and then there's just Joe Blogs commenting online. But how will people actually be able to approach Ofcom and make and see that complaints are dealt with? Not clear at all. But then we come back to Ofcom being responsible for misinformation and disinformation down the track. That they are going to do that, making their own appointments to that committee that will be decided according to the bill, basically by Ofcom itself, and secretaries of state don't have much say over that. And that's because of other legislative issues. That's partly because of something called the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010, that broadly took elected ministers away from the process of appointment, apparently to create a politically unbiased and independent civil service that has given quangos essentially oversight of themselves. So we'll be looking very closely at who are these appointments that Ofcom makes, who are, when it talks in, I think, section 30 of the bill about experts in misinformation and disinformation that it will appoint to this committee. We'll maybe we should make our own suggestions about who they should be. Claire and Matt, I'm sure you'd agree, but these are risks.
Yeah, well, actually, just because we're on this final section before we go out to the audience and I hand over to Jan, talking about lobbying, at that point that you made, is obviously one of the problems is that Ofcom has been, to use the phrase that's now luckily been understood, which is Ofcom have been stonewalled, as it say. Certainly a lot of gender critical feminists are very concerned about the lobbying in that particular direction, the number of protected characteristics and so on. So Ofcom itself is already contentious, as I was hinting, never mind before we get anywhere. And you talked about this exemption, and anyway, either of you can pick this up, Rado. I'd like to think it's not just that they were lobbied, but the government, certainly in the debates that I've had so far, and we haven't even formally discussed it, have said this is a pro-press freedom bill. right? Like, I mean, it's like, you know, Alice in Wonderland, what? And they've made this very clear. And they've said that this will protect journalism. In fact, it strengthens journalism. Of course, one of the suggestions is a new Quango, which just fills me with horror, because then we get into Rado's point, where he's going to be on that one then, with Nesta and BBC and so on and so on. But anyway, can you just explain a bit about this press freedom exemption? Because as far as I understand it, you're only free as a journalist in relation to this great proclamation if you kind of write on your own newspaper or broadcaster's website or intranet or whatever. But if you would happen to Facebook it, you could be in trouble, which, by the way, is one of the problems I've got with the Academic Freedom Bill, which is brilliant to have it. But if you're an academic who happens to go on Twitter with this bill in line, you could be out. So what any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, so the government's put in a few claims to which it is a few sections of which is claiming to say that it is a pro-free speech bill. And I think it's very important to unpack these and debunk these sequentially. So the first one is a duty to protect freedom of expression. Now that sounds nice, but then you very quickly realize when you go further down into the bill that any safety duties, so any of the duties related to, let's say, hate speech or disinformation, will overwrite that freedom of expression duty. There's only freedom of expression if Ofcom decides it is freedom of expression. So it's a very limited carve out. It's also very bizarre in a way to put a requirement onto private companies in this way. And I know there's a separate debate to be had about whether that's the right approach to the online companies, whether you want to force them to be pro-free speech or whether you think there should be more competition in the market. That's the first one. The second one is a protection about democratically important content, which is a secondary specific carve out that they are supposed to protect. That effectively means any topic that politicians think is important, more or less. It's whatever Ofcom decides is important. Once again, it is totalitarian in the truest sense of it. You're limiting debate to whatever the government decides is important, confined to debate. I'm afraid if you make a point that the government decides is not democratically important, you're outside of it. Now, in my opinion, I think any comment is that expressed by the demos, expressed by the people, is democratically important, and that you shouldn't be able to limit that. So the fact that that is a limiting factor is concerning. Now, the third protection is the one that you get into, which is journalistic content protection. And I hate to say it, but there was almost certainly lobbying from the Society of Editors and from the journalism industry. And there is a little bit of self-dealing going on here because certain sections of the media have been pushing this bill very hard. Some other sections of the media have said, wait a second, we use social media in order to attract people to our websites and sell news ads online and sell subscriptions or whatever else. And they've kind of clicked onto the fact that there is a potential danger in this bill. So therefore they want their content to be exempted. And so you've got on the one hand, the government saying, well, this doesn't have any impact on freedom of speech. Of course, this is a pro-freedom of speech bill, but we're giving exemptions to journalists. So they're creating a separate class of people who they are defining as journalists, who, however they may end up deciding who isn't a journalist, and saying that they will be protected in a way that no one else will be, which to me is an absolute farce of the rule of law. It is basically ridiculous. And we have never before tried to separately define journalists. We should know this is very important here. We don't actually define journalists anyway because we have broad free speech protections in our society, at least we should. They've increasingly been encroached. But the idea is that anything that I can say as a think tanker or anything, Sam Coates says on Sky News or Laura Kunzberg on the BBC, we should all have basically the same level of protection when we go to Twitter or when we use these platforms. They will have a different level of protection to us, and that creates an elite group of people. And there's some very bizarre things in there that they're meant to have special complaint procedures and whatever else for these journalists. Now, in practice, we're not sure how these are going to work and how strong they're going to be and whether or not journalistic content is actually protected and if it's only when you're sharing certain news articles or whatever else. It all gets very complicated very quickly, but the basis of it is disgraceful, in my opinion.
Okay, so Rado, anything quickly to add? Then I've just got one thing to say and I'll hand over to John.
Yeah, I mean, again, to be fair to the government, current government and its advisors have been landed with this bill that I think many of them realise is extremely dangerous for free speech, and they have done what they regard as what's politically feasible and tried to create these carve-outs. But as Matt said, when you look at the actual definitions in the carve-outs, they create first problems for just individuals' free speech online, and second, a very bad precedent. I mean, you look at the wording and it talks about the duty to protect journalistic content. And what's that? One of the definitions is UK linked. What does that mean? Is a debate online about climate change in Sri Lanka not UK linked? Of course it is, theoretically. And then duty to protect content of democratic importance, quote, contribute to political debate in the UK. again, says who? Who judges this? So this is, as Matt said, this is I don't know if it's totalitarian, it's certainly authoritarian, but it puts the state, not the demos, in the driving seat about deciding what of the demos's debate is relevant to democracy. And yeah, we've talked about what, this famous quote that Lord Bingham said, that government is not an activity about which only those professionally engaged are entitled to receive information. And that's, again, at the crux of this bill. Okay,
so my challenge to the audience, and the audience are now going to come and ask you both questions, but my challenge is twofold. I had an argument with someone offline about the fact that they were calling for the people who were trying to get GB News boycotted. There's a campaign going on that's trying to, successfully trying to encourage corporates to not take advertising out with GB News. And the person that I had the row with said that the organization that was running that campaign should be banned. And the reason why I'm telling you that is because they're a big free speecher. And I said, no, well, you can't be banned, can they? And they said, well, it's terrible that they're allowed to use Twitter to be censorious. We should ban them. And didn't. Anyway, that's quite a common sort of thing. Can we ban the ones we don't like? And secondly, the bill poses itself, and this is my other challenge to the audience, as, and the government believes, and I think I'm quoting you both here, that this will empower adult users to keep themselves safe online and protect freedom of expression by preventing companies arbitrarily removing content. And when I say about the doublespeak, but there is this sort of idea that it's posed as about us and protecting us from harassment, protecting us from all those horrible trolls that drive me mad and ruin my life, protecting us, and we can appeal. And so what are you worried about? So there's a kind of gaslighting attempt to say, this is all about the users, Claire. Don't you worry your pretty little head about the censorship question. It's just not happening.
I think it is a very interesting question about the way in which the internet has democratized debate. And I think we saw a kind of very changing narrative over the last decade when it comes to online speech. We saw with the Arab Spring a lot of celebration of the idea that normal people could express themselves and push back against their governments. And then when Trump and Brexit happened, it suddenly became, whoa, these normal people driven by hate and disinformation and all that crap. And narrative has very much driven the other direction. So there's been pressure onto these companies. I don't think independent of government, but certainly the companies have become more censorious. Now, I think the best solution to that is I don't necessarily buy the kind of narrative about kind of these are tech monopolies and they're censoring everyone, etc. I think they are being excessively censorious, but there are always other places you can go online. That's the big difference between what is state-directed mandate. There won't be other places you can go online, at least there won't be other platforms unless it's on the dark web or whatever else. So I do take state censorship to be very different to what is a private company censorship, even if those are large private companies that are throwing up all these kind of complex issues. In terms of alternatives, I mean, in the first instance, I'll say, I think this is an extremely difficult area. Even if you just focus on the unlawful content, these tech companies actually do not have an interest in there being unlawful material on their platforms. They don't want terrorist material. They don't want child exploitation material. That's not what Facebook, Twitter, Google want. They know it's a PR disaster. They know it's just not the platforms they want to have. And they're constantly struggling to get rid of that material. Now, can they do more? Probably. But I'm not convinced that Ofcom giving them directions from a high is going to do much to help that situation. Certainly it might put some pressure on them, but the technology is just so difficult to work out there's just so much content that this is the issue the platforms face when it comes to moderation. There is millions and millions of words and hours and speech and audio and all these different things going on. This is very hard to identify the content, unlawful content, let alone all this additional stuff the government now wants them to deal with in terms of what is psychologically difficult. It is a very challenging area. And I don't think we're quite mastered. And even with, the best AI in the world that Facebook might use, I know I once, I recently put on Facebook a comment like Americans are weird, and that got deleted as a form of hate speech. Now, I would say that's just a statement of fact. Some of my best friends are Americans, but I do love the American people. But it's that kind of example where if you start using AI to get rid of speech and content that you think is problematic, you're going to find it very difficult to do.
First of all, the traditional ways that we understand things all have to be shaken up, and we all, the report rightly quotes J.S. Mill a lot, and so do I, but we also have got to make these arguments anew and afresh, and develop our own JS mills. And I say that because, you know, whereas traditionally you think the state censorship is the most frightening, and, you know, private companies kind of in doing these kind of things are not really the issue. I think when you've got group, you know, organizations like Facebook and Twitter involved, I think I'm not going to choose who's the worst guy on this one, right? I think it's equally scary, and you end up in this situation where at least the state has got some democratic oversight, whereas the state handing over or all its power to the major tech companies to police our speech actually scares the life out of me, because we've got no way into that at all. We're completely sidelined as the public.
Potentially come in there on a few of the points. I think there was a question earlier on about Hope Not Hate and GB News, and I think I share Claire's view that even though we might not particularly like their advocacy, we should stand by their right to advocate against advertisers presenting on GB News, as that is what ultimately protects everyone's free speech, and they should be able to express those ideas. I think that should be our premise when it comes to all free speech, going back to kind of Tony's comments about what should be the limits. I think I basically agree with Rado. We did an Oxford Institute paper on this about a free speech act in the UK, talking about not thinking about the online safety bill, but existing communications laws that already limit free speech online, and talking about a free speech act for the UK that would basically only mean direct incitement to some kind of violent or criminal act would be unlawful. I'll just put that in the chat for anyone who wants to have a look at that particular paper.
My personal concern is that interventions to stop children accessing porn, which, to be clear, I think children should be prevented from accessing porn, and I completely agree with you about the potential psychological impacts of it. And for what it's worth, yes, I am a parent. I think those interventions have to be effective, because the risk that we're talking about is if people believe, and this is a general risk as well, is if people believe that the internet has been made safe for children, which is a possible side effect of this bill, then parents become less cautious about their children's internet use. And I think age verification is one possibility in that, but I think that our point is that these interventions simply have to work, not simply give the appearance of working or satisfy legislators.
I think it is a very thorny issue, and I don't think anyone wants children to be able to access material that is in any way inappropriate for them, and will cause them harm, and believe in the sovereignty of parents to decide that what kind of material they can act, as well as how that passes along. Now, I think the online safety bill is not going to solve this problem. I mean, this is a very important point to make. It's not about even age verification of pornography sites, it's age verification of Facebook and Twitter. The best way to do this, and I think somebody in the chat pointed this out, is that there are, if you're concerned about your own children, you do have the option to install certain software on their computers that can limit more, much better, and you can actually see what they're doing as well, if that's the kind of way you choose to parent your child. I think there's other complexities here as well to think about. There are certain, there's certain adult topics that might be appropriate for a 17-year-old, or in a discussion that is legal at the moment, a discussion they can access, that somebody might consider is not appropriate for child sensibilities. Now, I'm imagining here you're a gay kid in a village, and you're the only gay in the village. You want to go online, and you're 17 years old, but then you need to age verify in order to access a forum where you can kind of talk to other people, not in a sexual way, but just other people who might be going through something similar to you. And that would be something that would be very difficult as a result of the online safety bill. So that's a kind of example there practically where, because you have to age verify to access things that these sites decide are only appropriate for adults, even though you might be a very mature 17-year-old. And these again are very complex issues, because that might not be appropriate for a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old. And therefore we should be very careful about how we conceptualize these issues and what children can access. We should also note that by default, everyone is being treated like a child here. So before they age verify, and that will be the default state of the social media sites and things like YouTube as well in future. So there's a bit of a risk there as well.
There's no doubt about it. There are thorny issues. So just on the practical sense, one of the things that I very much appreciate about the work that Matthew and Rado and the FSU are doing is that they've actually come up with some practical amendments to resolve certain issues. And the point is, they don't involve censorship, but they might involve greater you know, different kinds of legislative interventions to protect against real harms. And when I say real harms, you know, these things are judgment calls. I understand that, but say for example, not so that I don't get trapped on the children question, but say for example, self-harm and suicide sites. What do you do about it? It sounds terrible, doesn't it? You know, that there are people who incite young people to commit suicide, and it's kind of community of self-harmers and pro-suicide, and this exists. And I've written about it in a different context in terms of the rise of narcissism. And you know, one has to make very fine distinctions about whether that was an incitement for somebody to kill themselves. And well done the FSU for thinking about that and coming up with ideas. And if Rebecca doesn't like the ones that are around children, I hope that other people will come up with ideas. The main thing is it's got nothing to do with speech. But the problem is that it gets thrown, it is nothing to do with free speech. It's not what the FSU or anyone here is trying to ignore or say is not a problem. But those issues are used to stop you having, basically to bring this bill in that then sweeps up everything in its wake.
I just wanted to provide some context to this discussion. Not that you haven't been doing that already, but it occurs to me that what's prompting this bill is a kind of moral panic about ordinary people being led astray by bad actors on the internet. And there is underpinning this bill this assumption that ordinary people don't have the necessary intellectual equipment to guard themselves from attempts by bad actors to manipulate them, that if they're exposed to certain kinds of information by Russian bots or by UKIP or by people promoting the Leave cause in the EU referendum, they're very vulnerable to that and they need protecting from that. And it seems to me there's something similar in the thinking behind this bill to the attitude of, you know, the Lord Chamberlain in the days before the Chatterley trial. The idea is that ordinary people who haven't been to university or haven't been to elite universities, they don't have the intellectual equipment to protect themselves, to deal with exposure to dangerous ideas, and they need to be protected from dangerous ideas lest they be led astray and end up storming the Capitol building or some equivalent. And people often invoke these episodes like the storming of the Capitol building, like the murder of Joe Cox and the supposed epidemic of hate incidents as the reason why ordinary people need to be protected in this way. And OFCOM in this kind of analogy have become the kind of, they're really being this bill is going to appoint OFCOM as the new Lord Chamberlain, the kind of government appointed official protector of ordinary people from information that could drive them mad in some way, lead them to behave immorally. I think it's that's the argument we need to somehow get to grips with and kind of rebut.
But one of the things that I wanted to say that I'm very worried about is a disillusion with mainstream media and an increasing feeling by lots of particularly young, ordinary people that the big internet companies are not to be trusted is driving them not into becoming Guardian readers or reformed characters, but into the dark web, where they're actually going down quite a few rabbit holes as it happens, and you can't get at them. Because if you basically say all these platforms are now going to police everything you've ever said, and you're going to be, and so on and so forth, people don't stop talking. They just go somewhere else that you can't get to them. So it really is going to drive underground, and the most unhealthy thing then that happens is that creates the very thing which, in a way, the scaremongers present the whole of the internet as. Whereas if these things are openly debated and discussed, we can see them in front of us, and then it's much easier. But they don't, because they don't trust ordinary people to deal with things. They're forcing, or not forcing, but they're they're actually having the context of getting lots of ordinary people to leave the public square, but they're not kind of just sitting at home knitting. They're going elsewhere where we can't see, and that's actually not good for democracy, because there's not then an open debate and an ability to refute genuinely misinformed misinformation. And that, which is the best way you can do that, is by having an argument, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think these are great points, and I think it speaks to what Toby was saying about the state or the bureaucracy has come to think that people are vulnerable unless they're, Oxford PPEists or whatnot. They can't possibly avoid being led astray by these bad people online. And the center of this is what we've been talking about with disinformation. That what the last year has shown is that actually the marketplace of ideas, or the demos, freely debating issues, is much better at getting to the truth and working out what disinformation is. Because, yeah, you mentioned the Fauci emails. It's a very interesting case. We've talked about the Wuhan lab leak. That what these protectors, these precautionary principle players in our debate tend to do is consider anything that could be harmful, that if people extrapolated it and took against government in general, those are the things that need censoring. Whereas, of course, what people need to do is develop immunity, develop a kind of mental immunity to disinformation. And if they believe that the web has been sanitized of untruths, they will become more gullible, not less, if this agenda is allowed to really take root and the censors are allowed to get to work and the anti-disinformation fact checkers are allowed to purge the internet of what they regard as untruth. They will become that will be dangerous for democracy. The populace will be uninformed, because actually these truths are being revealed online by individual amateur journalists, not by registered journalists, not by registered news providers, but by this is why I call it a kind of a counter-reformation feeling. We talk about this in our briefings on the online safety bill, and the issue for us is physical harm, is violence. I think every society in history has imposed some limits on free speech, and we talk about there might be a case in legislation for example, preventing the encouragement of FGM online and the arrangement of FGM online, even though the people doing the speech are not carrying it out. There are traditional common law restrictions on speech that might or that is liable to result in violence, imminent violence. So that's where the harm principle, the harm line, should be drawn, although of course it's never clear and this is always in debate. But the concept of harm has been taken in the last generation from physical to psychological harm. The concept of safety, this has come out by universities in particular, the concept of safety has been changed from personal physical safety to mental safety. And a lot of the civil servants and activists who are pushing for these limits online have been inculcated. They've really gone through a process in universities of being told that debate is an offensive debate is inherently unsafe, and the misapplication of the word trauma is another symptom of that. So that's really where we see that debate. Personally, I don't think most of the tech giants will be bothered about this bill. And I think the claims by the government that they are taking on the big internet companies, taking on the Facebooks of this world, have a Punch and Judy element to them, because these are very big corporates. These are some of the largest companies in the world now in one case, and they can easily afford the costs on their compliance departments to handle the complaints, to deal with OFCOM. What this will mean is that people increasingly don't have anywhere else to go, because that will pull up the ladder, that regulation will pull up the ladder from the British startups that we were hoping would emerge to challenge the big American social media companies that will now probably never exist. And one of the original purposes of this bill was to make the UK not just the safest place to go online, but the best place to start a digital business. And on that front, epic fail. It's going to do terrible harm in that regard. And I'm afraid this is a big problem for the economies in general, is that we harm innovation by this burdensome regulation. This is another example of that. So where's it coming from? All sorts of places, but not SMEs generally.
I don't think the platforms don't support this, but nor do they feel like they can push back strongly against it, because they feel the political winds are pushing so far in the other direction. They're getting so much pressure from people who just quite frankly don't like them for all sorts of different reasons on both the left and the right. And therefore they're kind of more or less, they're not capitulating, but they're not showing very strong opposition to this. Just because of all those forces about child protection or about terrorism or just about disinformation, about racism, whatever it may be. There's just a lot of political winds that are pushing in the other direction. And I think it is important organizations like the FSU make positive cases. I think it's important as well that most MPs most of the time have 1,000 things on their plate and they don't know anything about the online safety bill. They might be focused on some completely different issues. In some ways, it's up to you to bring it to their attention so that they know that this is a problem that their constituents are concerned about when it comes before Parliament. And that because they're getting so much pressure on the other side from people who do want the internet to be more censored, anything you can do to speak to people in political positions of political responsibility, or sending emails to your MP or whatever else, even if they don't take a strong interest in it, just having some counter pressure on this particular topic and on other pieces of legislation, I think is quite powerful.
Please contact your MPs. I mean, ask them for appointments at advice surgeries and tell them that you're bothered about this, because exactly as Matt says, at any one time they have a lot on their plate, and the specialist lobbying organizations will be pushing in a generally pro-censorship way. So that's a big thing that people can do. What we'll be doing is releasing a briefing soon on the amendments that we think this bill needs, and there are probably quite a few. So look out for more on that soon, and we'll be pushing quite hard on that.
On the technical things, I'm so delighted that Rado and people are going to be writing those amendments, suggesting those amendments. I will certainly be trying to put forward amendments in the House of Lords. But one thing you should note is that the House of Commons, as we've just seen tonight in relation to the vote in terms of extending, the different issue of COVID and lockdown and so on, the government has got such a large majority that do whatever you can in terms of lobbying your MPs and so on. But what's happened since I've been in there is that people are basically saying the Commons is irrelevant, the government wins everything, the House of Lords is where all the changes happen. I'm just saying that because I've watched that happen. The House of Lords now has a disproportionate influence over legislation because they can actually mess things up, and the government seems to accommodate to all that, generally to make them more reactionary, by the way, in my opinion. But there's no reason why we shouldn't try and use it to make things more free speechy in this instance. But in the end, that's all technical. That's what the FSU's got to do. I get that. But what really has to happen is that we create a real public buzz and discussion around these issues. Highlight the detail of it, not just say it's a free speech attack. Choose, 5 or 6 of the most egregious aspects, have debates everywhere. Everyone should be talking about this bill. Everyone needs to, because the politicians are spineless in the end, absolute jellyfish, right? And if they can get a sense that on a few things, the public are up in arms about freedom, you never know, you stand a chance, right? So in other words, it's not just behind the scenes lobbying or amendments. That's essential, but that won't be sufficient. There has to be an outraged public, demanding that they stop stamping all over our free speech. And that's what groups like the Academy of Ideas try and do, what you're trying to do, what we've all got to do. We've got to do it better. We've got to be smarter. We need new JSMLs.
Thanks so much, Claire. And thank you all, everybody, for coming tonight, and especially to Rado, Matthew and Claire for giving up their time. I just wanted to say a very quick thing about our next event. So our next event is a speakeasy on July the 13th, and our guest will be Professor Kathleen Stock. Speaking of people who speak their minds, stand up and make a massive difference, an incredible difference to the way the debate has gone in this country. We're delighted to have Kathleen speaking to us, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sussex, a very good friend of the FSU, absolutely stalwart defender of freedom of speech, and someone who's really been at the forefront of pushing back against the attempts to rewrite everyday language and the kind of long-standing common sense concepts that are being undermined at the moment. And I can see that Lisa Keogh's been here all evening. Really, really pleased to see you here, Lisa. Hopefully you'll come back to that one. We'll give you all a clap at the end, both for finishing your MA or your degree under considerable pressure, but also on...
heroine. You're my heroine, Lisa. Well done. Well done.
So please join us on July the 13th to discuss where Toby will be in conversation with Kathleen Stock. The details will be going out very soon. So I encourage everybody else to join the Free Speech Union like Lisa's done, and we'll see you next time.